Today is World Press Freedom Day, a day set aside to celebrate the role of the media in advancing human rights as well as raising challenges faced by journalists in different countries. In South Africa, the theme is journalism and elections in times of disinformation. And tonight I'm joined by Minke Statler from Amnesty International South Africa. Minke, thank you for coming around and being with us here on the program. And via Skype, Modise, the chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum. And welcome, Modise. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
And I want you to give us a sense of the South African, or the role of the press in South Africa overall, and the changes that you've seen in the past few years. What are the new challenges, and why, on the other hand, should we celebrate the role of the press in the country?
Tim, comparatively in Africa, we are one of the few countries where media freedom is actually protected in our constitution and is there in the Bill of Rights, which is something that we need to cherish, especially as we mark 25 years into our democracy. However, if you look at the World Press Index that was released ahead of today, it shows that we have dropped about 3 places, and one of the concerns they raise is that we have not been able to consolidate media freedom, and we were not surprised. I mean, obviously, we are not happy that we are dropping, and we are also not happy that we are in the second category that talks about countries that have satisfactory media freedom, but we are not in the first category, which is good, which is where we would like to be as a country. And one of the things that we think, or some of the factors that we think have contributed to this, is the attacks that we have seen on journalists over the last few years. I mean, the attacks have come from our political parties, ranging from, a whole deputy president of the second opposition parties attacking a reporter physically within the precinct of parliament, or the verbal abuse that we have seen hurled at reporters that are critical of political parties. We've seen the governing party call Peter Louis Mayberg Stratcom, which is a term that was used during the apartheid era, and talked about intelligence interference in the newsrooms. We've seen also our journalists going out into communities trying to tell those stories, but community members then turning on them and actually attacking them. And those are the worrying signs for us, especially as we mark 25 years of freedom. And just simply to say, as we get, a quarter of a century, we should actually be maturing as a democracy. Well,
I want to pick up a couple of points which I know some members of the public in South Africa have issues with when it comes to the media, but we'll raise those in a moment. Minke, I want you to give me a sense from Amnesty International's point of view what the situation is facing the facing journalists and the independence of the media in respective countries. You can start with the African continent.
Yes, so exactly. South Africa is still relatively free, and Modise has explained all of that, although also as an organization we've also been, watching these incidences that have been happening. On the continent, it's sometimes less good. Even in Mozambique at the moment, we are actually working on a case of a gentleman called Amande Ababwakar, and he was actually in prison now for 4 months. He was released on the 23rd of April, but pending trial, and it's really on trumped-up charges. He was doing his job. He was interviewing people that were fleeing the militant groups in the north of Mozambique, and we really, feel that governments in these countries are starting to clamp down, and the spaces are shrinking. Zimbabwe, Zambia, Madagascar, and it's very worrying for us from a continental point of view. Also, Sudan, for example. Also, if you take it a bit wider, the country that actually has the most journalists in prison at the moment is Turkey, with 120 journalists in prison and 156 media outlets closed down in recent years. And what we think is happening is that people don't like what they're hearing, and they don't understand that freedom of speech, you're not always going to like everything you hear, and that your freedom as an individual is you also being able to speak your mind, but it's also books being published that you might not like, or articles being published that you don't agree with. But it's all about the discourse and the debate, and really keeping that free and open, which is a cornerstone of any society. So if you start losing that media freedom, you're actually starting to lose the cornerstone of a free society. And so even here in South Africa, even though it's not as bad as say in Turkey, we are, we mustn't be complacent. We must really fight for the freedom of our media.
But what I find interesting is that in South Africa, notwithstanding what some individual politicians may have said or done, that members of the public themselves increasingly are not so sure about the independence of the, and they actually attack the media itself. They say they do not trust it. You see, the trust levels seem to have gone down. Let me get Mahlatse to comment, and then let me hear your views on that. Yeah.
Tim, I think it's quite important to separate the two, right? Because the constitutional framework must always remain, and the principles that are contained in our constitution must remain. But when we talk about the trust relationship between the public and the media, I think it is a process that has happened in the past 3 years. I don't know if you remember, Tim, probably at your time at the public broadcaster, there was a time when the public broadcaster was the second most trusted institution after religious institutions. And that spoke to what it was able to do. But we know that over the years, we have seen in the era of the likes of Kaudi Mutsueneng, where there was interference in the editorial integrity of the SABC. And the stories that the SABC was telling were not the full story of the South African public. And people can obviously see that. And once you lose that trust, it is very difficult to rebuild. But equally so, we know and remember the Bell Pottinger campaign, which was a campaign that had really deep pockets, and it was very well planned and actually executed. Because remember, this campaign was about let's create the distrust between the public and actually the media. But then on the other side, when you look at what the media has done for this country, I mean, we talk about hopefully a different plan for South Africa because of the work that the media has done. I mean, all of the reporters, or most of the reporters that reported on Gupta leaks, those reporters needed private security, but they went ahead and did it. You go to State Capture Commission, some of the revelations that are coming from there, that is the work of journalists. They have been exposing the rot and actually the corruption.
And I understand you. The point is, why would there be less appreciation for that role that the media has played and continues to play in our society? And it could be that we also take the democratic freedoms for granted. I just wonder, are you concerned about that? As SANEF, for instance, that it appears to me, though, that some members of the public do not appreciate or understand how the media works and what its role is in a democratic setting.
So I just wanted us to be aware of the context of how we get here. But secondly, what we saw happen, I don't know if you remember the murder of the Mozambican national in Alexandra. The reason the people that were actually prosecuted was because it was the media that had the pictures and that showed what actually happened, and that was actually used as part of evidence. So when you look at community protests in South Africa, some of them are hijacked by criminal elements, and when journalists start exposing when they looting bottle stores and stealing bottles of liquor, the first thing they want to do is turn on the media because they want the media not to show them doing it. They don't like the narrative. So people want to control the narrative. Please must fall. We saw it. As soon as the media was starting to ask questions they were uncomfortable with, the students turned on the media. And similarly, communities are also doing the same.
Well, Menke, as you said, elsewhere in the world, some parts journalists do so under serious threat to even their lives and freedoms. But we live in the age of disinformation, and it's not only an issue here in South Africa, a global one, including the American president, for instance, who's been leading the charge in his nation. He's very influential across the world, making disparaging remarks about other news outlets. But to what extent is disinformation a problem around the world? Fake news. We can start with the U.S.
So yes, with the U.S. disinformation, fake news, it is a huge problem. But what we've been seeing that's very positive is the development of how to fight the fake news. So it might be a bit slow, but we're seeing organizations in South Africa that are really fighting disinformation, saying, let's get 5 or 6 different news agencies, for example, collaborating one story and really showing people in that way that the media can be trusted. And really, we believe as an organization that we do need to re-emphasize to people out there what the role of the media in society is, what the role of freedom of expression is, how it affects them in their daily lives. And by doing that, we can fight fake news through organizations like Africa Check. And also you were mentioning the investigative journalists as well. It's a really, really strong thing that we have in South Africa is the investigative journalism, but how can we strengthen it even more and in that way rebuild public trust? And in America, you know, how can the social media platforms also play a positive role in fighting disinformation and fighting fake news?
Now, Mahlatse, in terms of SANEF, what do you think? Firstly, what is the manifestation of fake news? Because I think it's a challenge to audiences and readers in South Africa. So how can people tell fake news apart from real news? And number two, what do you think as SANEF you can and should do to educate the public about the different types of news that we find these days? I mean, with the sprouting, mushrooming of different news websites, for instance.
So, Tim, I don't want to leave this conversation saying that, you know, the media has not played a role in terms of the distrust that has been created between the public. Yes, we know the mistakes that the media has done. We know the front page apologies some of the weekly newspapers have had to do because they simply got the stories wrong, and that has contributed to the problem. But when we talk about disinformation, which is, of course, the false spreading of information to deliberately deceive, I think that the problem there is more with the likes of Facebook and Google and WhatsApp. Because when you talk about media institutions, there's still accountability. We have the Press Council, we have the Broadcasting Complaints Commission, but there's so much more that is actually being spread via the social networks, which is quite difficult because you can't hold anybody accountable for those. And that's why now towards the elections, we have a website called the Real 411, which is a collaboration with Media Monitoring Africa and the IEC to allow the public to come forward and say, you know, is this true, and actually test the information that is out there. We are always encouraging readers to say, when you're seeing a story, and I'm going to be crude because we have seen it, where somebody big has been reported to have died, but you look at the three broadcasters, you look at any of the major online platforms or any of the newspapers, and they are not reporting it, chances are that is actually false. And actually, you need to take a second look. We know that there are also copycats out there where they're basically copying some of the known websites with different URLs, but basically using the colors and similar names to try and confuse the public. And we're just saying to the public, just take a second look every time. Sometimes when the stories are just too good to be true, just read it again and check who is actually the source. But then the responsibility is also within the media to say you have to get it right the first time so that the journalists or the public can know where to actually go for the right information.
And Mahlatse, thank you very much. Menke, a quick comment from you. What is going on around the world in trying to deal with this scourge of fake news?
Exactly. So something like the Real 411 is fantastic. We know about it as well, and it needs to go beyond the elections. And even holding, we were mentioning Google, social media platforms to account as well. So within governments, there might be policies, institutes, organizations, ombudsmen that can hold to account, but what are we doing with social media? In China, Amnesty, we are actually holding Google to account because they want to develop a search engine there called Dragonfly, and we believe that it's promoting censorship because there's certain things in China that, so like Tiananmen Square, that you can't look up, and that's a form of censorship. So we've actually really actively engaged with Google, for example, on how they're going to be accountable and how they influence the way that people in China see news, but it goes wider than China. It goes all over the world and in South Africa as well.
Menke Stetler, thank you very much for having been with us on the show. I appreciate it. Now, the economic situation in South Africa has been very negative for young people, with the majority not employed or receiving any training. And of course, we've got a whole number of policy initiatives. We've got companies trying this and trying that. But does South Africa really know what young South Africans want to see happen in this economy? We'll be probing that issue in a moment.